happening. You go on. She did it. Okay. Shall I? Do you want to introduce? Okay. Get comfy. Hi everyone, and welcome to Spiritual Waffle. No, don't no.
No,
No.
just no.
Just
Straight up no. That. Thank you for listening.
Bye then. Great chat.
What are you gonna say?
Hi everyone, and welcome to Spiritual Waffle. I am Sarah Mooney Jones,
And I am Jess Simonson.
and today we're actually going to do a little bit of an intro into who we are and a short. We're going to try and make it a short,
Hopefully.
chat about our lives. just a small topic that has basically led us to where we are now and why we are doing a podcast on spirituality and how that's developed through our lives. Good, yeah. So, Jess,
Yes.
tell me a bit about your childhood and in relation to energy and spirituality. Was any of that prevalent in your early childhood?
Not really. Ever since I can remember, I was dancing. So that's pretty much what I did at every spare moment. I do remember I must have been maybe 11, 10 or 11, and I got in with a crowd at school. And what you're going to think is that it's a bad crowd, but it actually wasn't. It was more like a witchy crowd, where the best kind of crowd. And I basically had decided that I was a white witch and that I needed books on crystals and how to do spells. And I got into like incense sticks, and basically the only spell that I can remember doing is the finding spell, because I used to lose my shit, not emotionally but like actual stuff all the time. I was such scatterbrain, so I only really remember doing that one. But I was really interested in the spiritual realm. I think I remember doing the spells and sitting and having some sage and just very much playing the part of what I thought I should have been doing as a self professed white witch. But I don't know if I actually believed that that's
Did
what
you
I
find the
was.
shit?
I did find the shit though.
Proof in the
There we
pudding.
go. But I know I enjoyed it. I did that for a little bit, and then I obviously got bored and kind of moved on. But I remembered because when I came back to it later on in life, the smell of sage took me back to being in my pink and purple bedroom at the farmhouse where I grew up when I was 10, and yeah, thinking that I was a witch.
So you grew up on a farm?
Grew up on a farm. So have my father's a farmer and my mum's a graphic designer. So it was not spiritual, as far as I know, and knowing what I know of them now, when I talk about spirituality, there's a lot of like, kind of potentially rolling of the eyes. But I see it as like, they just put it down to me being weird and kind of kooky, and that sort of works with my like personality. But yeah, nothing of that from my parents' side, or really my friends, apart from a couple of my friends who I thought I was a white witch with. I felt like I grew out of it until I spoke to somebody recently who said, watch out for, or not watch out, but be attuned to the stuff that you warmed to when you were little, because children have an intuition that we lose as adults, and the things that you like absolutely loved were probably the things that you will either circle back to, or the things that are maybe missing, or that can add to your feeling of purpose.
It's interesting though as well, isn't it? Because what you're describing there to me sort of says like, okay, so the spirituality, it's that thing again, isn't it? Of like, what is the spirituality? Oh, well, it is being a white witch in this circumstance, and that kind of differentiation to what your parents might have associated it as. Yet at the same time, your dad being a farmer with that deep connectedness to nature and the earth, from at this stage in my life is something that I would say, he was probably living a very spiritually aligned life without having to use a terminology or a phrase to define it as such,
Or
just
without him
living.
even knowing.
Yeah.
Because I think if I said, Dad, look at me, are you spiritual? Like, do you feel like any of the things that you do on the farm is spiritual? I think he'd say no. But you're right, like working with the land, I question whether his the way that he farms is the very similar to the way my grandfather farmed. And my grandfather, it's been in the family for generations, and it very much is, this is our job, this is the land is ours to take what we need from it. It's not necessarily working with, I think it is more now because my dad's working with a few companies who are helping bring birds back, and we have wild, areas of wildflower meadows, because he's very aware of what's going on in the world right now. But yeah, I would say before that, it was a very, from what I can see, it's a very practical, this is my job, this is what my father did, my father did before that, and this is just how you do it. It's not necessarily connecting with the land so much as just, this is how we've always done it. But I suppose it is in a way, for sure.
Hmm.
What about you?
Um, so I grew up in Belfast.
Mm.
Shocker that that wasn't noticeable at all.
Mm.
In Northern Ireland. And yeah, from a really young age, to be honest, I had a real awareness of what I would now describe essentially as energy. I would pick up, which I think I feel most kids actually are quite attuned to, picking up frequencies and vibrations, people's feelings, and even I'd go as far to say as like their thoughts. And actually, that as a kid, I found quite terrifying, to be honest. I think mainly because I didn't know what to do with it. And most of the time, what I felt like I was perceiving and getting was the opposite to what they were projecting. And so it kind of at times meant that I found adults, I mistrusted grown-ups and adults. I felt like there was an untruth that wasn't being said. And I think that's mainly because most of the stuff that I perceived, I was probably perceiving lots of good things as well, but I only ever really was noticing it when it was something that was negative or a little bit dark or a little bit adult content, I guess, for my small brain to kind of understand. So I was always acutely aware of energies, the energies of spaces, of people, things that people were giving off. And I found that a bit overwhelming. And so I was always playing with crystals and doing all kinds of little witchy business. And I guess the struggle for me was the only kind of, because I didn't know what it was, and I couldn't. It was all the unseen world, and I had a real avid interest and awareness of stuff that was unseen, but came from quite a practical family, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, who kind of humored all of my stuff for sure. And I guess growing up in Belfast, the only framework I had to put that into the context was religion and God, and that being the Irish Catholicism, which is what I was born into. And that didn't make it any easier because, for me as a kid, that God was pretty fucking terrifying.
Mm.
And so I didn't really understand that. That never sat well with me either. There was like this kind of, from what I can remember being taught anyway at school, primarily primary school, it was like this all loving God, all forgiving, all holding God, but who was a guy. But if you didn't live life and abide by a particular set of rules and regulations, then you're going to be condemned to eternal suffering and hell. And that was also incredibly terrifying. And that, I think, my perception of this kind of religious framework as well in Belfast was that all it did was create an immense amount of division, hatred for the opposite sides. Obviously, I grew up in what would have been called, I guess, the tail end of the Troubles. My mum reminds me on the daily that I did not grow up in the height of the Troubles, but I don't know what that was like because it was pretty fucking troubled whenever I was growing up as well. And there was a lot of violence and a lot of shootings and bombings and a lot of division, and a lot of segregation. And I think what I struggled with the older I got was that nobody can really, I think I don't know, but I would think most Catholics and Protestants would actually struggle to differentiate, to tell you what exactly is the difference between Catholics and Protestants, because it's the same God and there's a few nuances in there. But I spent most of my childhood asking those questions. What is the difference? Like, what are these differences? Why do we hate on each other so much? And I was lucky enough that both my mom and my granddad very much tried to bring me up with a wider perspective of, non bigotry and not judging people based on the religion they were born into and just accepting people for who they were. And they worked very hard to send me to the only high school in Belfast that had both Catholics and Protestants. But I still struggled with this because I honestly, to my bones, I knew that there was a God. To me, I didn't need to believe in anything because I felt it. I felt a higher power. I felt an unseen presence. It just didn't marry up with the particular religious connotations I was being presented with. And so that aspect was a bit scary and a bit unknown. And if I'm honest, it only really, the penny only really dropped when I was 18 and I went to university in England. And embarrassingly, it was pretty much the first time that I became aware that there were other religions and other gods and other things that people believed in. And finally, I felt like, oh, this makes sense. This is a choice and almost a human, a man construct of an idea, an ideology. And to me, anyway, just to me, and the fact that it was perhaps metaphorical analysis of what was hard to explain in any other way. And that kind of I found quite liberating because then I was like, oh, I get to choose. I don't have to just choose that guy. I can choose my guy. And, when asked throughout my whole life, at that age, do you believe in God? Because that was a normal conversation to have. I would always say yes, but my God is one chilled out motherfucker. um, so that's when it kind of all started to shift a bit more for me. What about you around that age?
Um, so I remember we have family members, my great uncle who was a priest, so I remember going to church, but my mum and my dad sort of doing it for the family, not because they wanted to. We never went to church because we fancied going to church on a Sunday morning. Um, and then both of my parents were very much like, you kind of believe what you want to believe, just crack on and we'll be here for you, which is great. And I think I listened to, I want to say it was Ricky Gervais in my teens, and he said he was an
Oh
atheist.
yeah, that speech on atheism. Yeah, it's
And
brilliant.
I just decided that that was me.
Mm.
And I was like, cool, I believe that. Um, I then watched, it's just how impressionable my brain is. One of my favorite films is Hot Fuzz. And Simon Pegg says in the film, to a priest, the priest says, oh, are you an atheist? And he said, I'm not closed off from the idea of religion, I'm just not completely convinced by it.
Mm.
And I thought that was kind of a good, I sort of took that. I couldn't put into words how I felt. I knew I wanted to have an opinion. I didn't I enjoyed going to church in the fact that I thought they were amazing buildings and I felt a power in them, the stained glass windows and everything. I didn't like how I've never liked how people use religion and have used religion among other stuff to separate themselves. I've always felt, and it's been kind of a whimsical feeling of, can't we just all get along together? Like, why do we need to create these things? I know they're so deeply ingrained in so many people, in their culture, their religion, how they've been brought up. But ultimately, if we are to believe that Adam and Eve were the first two people on this earth, we are all brothers and sisters. In the like non, if we're taking out the spiritual, the woo woo, we are technically brothers and sisters of descents. So, in that respect, we're all the same, and we could we have the capacity to treat everybody as if they were a brother and sister, because a lot of us have siblings who we treat very well. So I knew I didn't like what religion did to people, but as I got older, seeing how faith brought people together in a positive way and how it got people through tough times, I went from being a very strong atheist and kind of proud to be, oh, I don't believe in it, it's all a load of hooey. Watching Hot Fuzz, listening to Simon Pegg in that line and going, oh, actually, that fits with me better. I would sort of, through my life, I'd have opinions until I heard another person's opinion, and I'd be like, that's the language that I needed. That makes more sense to me. And then yeah, so religion, and I don't know if I don't know if I've actually asked my parents. I don't think they do believe in God. I think maybe all of me and my sisters and my parents were the same at one point, where it would be nice. And I think there's a lot of people who go, yeah, it'd be nice, be lovely, wouldn't it be, if there would be a God up there and we would have somebody to look out over us, and there's sort of a reason for everything. But whether people are actually truly convinced by that God or that religion remains to be seen.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think like similarly, that kind of what from what I'd witnessed of religion was so harsh that I thought there's very little God in that to me, the what I feel and sense and actually I started to learn about the pagan traditions, which was also kind of crazy because whenever I grew up, everything I ever heard about pagans was that they were devil worshippers. That's kind of how the dialogue was, the narrative was strung through my experience of growing up in Northern Ireland. And it was only actually when became, a younger adult and started looking into these things, into pagan traditions, that I started to realize that they they were all very similar to some of the religious festivals and what their metaphors were representing, but just honoring the lands and nature and the cycles and all living creatures. And I found real comfort in that. That felt like that was aligned to me. It felt like, oh, we are no better or worse than any other creature that walks on this planet, and we are all kind of part of that. So that helped me kind of start to bring, I think, ritual back into my life, whereas I'd kind of previously associated ritual with church. And a bit like you, I knew that like when I used to go into churches throughout my whole life on my own, not for the masses, because I didn't really enjoy the preachy bit. Sometimes they would make some point that I'd be like, oh, I see underneath how that would make sense, but it just seemed to come with a lot of terms and conditions that I didn't really resonate with. But I would sit on my own in churches, and now realizing a lot of these churches were built on sacred energy lines and sacred sites because of the power of the energy that it holds and the healing capabilities, and even the church bells. Now we do so much sound healing, and the bells themselves resonated with a particular vibration that would heal. I just didn't like what the noise that was kind of coming out of the people that were representing those churches. So that really helped me begin to sort of do rituals and continue. I always did rituals with the moon. Full moons and new moons felt very akin to the moon and its energies, and obviously our cycles, and the fact that we live, our entire bodies are cyclically dependent upon the moon, as is the stability on the planet, as are the tides and our periods, our fertility, etc., etc. And that kind of helped develop that aspect of, I guess, a spiritual practice, which then led me into real interest in not normal physics. Wasn't very good at normal physics. Wasn't very good at any normal subjects at school. But quantum physics, loved a bit of quantum physics, and no expert, but loved learning about quanta and protons and light waves and the unseen, the fact that how to quantify things that were not seen, wavelengths and particles. that exist, that are scientifically proven, but that you cannot see. And the fact then that that leads into the fact that we're all made up of the same stuff, then really helped me kind of solidify that ideology of what we mean when we say, we're all one. We are all one. We're all made up. The majority of all of us, the majority of our matter is actually exactly the same as substance, as what everything else is, whether that's inanimate objects or living creatures. And the intelligence that lives behind these particles is kind of what helped me marry science with spirituality. Spirituality to me being connectedness, higher power, intuition, inner knowing, knowing that there's something bigger than just yourself. And then, but finding that all just not tangible enough as a child, and needing it to be more tangible. And then I think quantum physics, although incredibly complicated and I still haven't got my head around half of it, really helped me understand us at a cellular level and our connectedness and the power that lies within each one of our cells, and how that radiates the electromagnetic fields that go all the way up into source. And that kind of helped me, because I never wanted it to be, I never felt like it was one or the other, like either science or spirituality. It's felt like science helps you understand spirituality, as to what we are, so that you don't just, I didn't want to just put blind faith in a concept that I had, no evidence, so to speak, of. So yeah, and then I went off on a complete tangent in my adult life, doing something that I wouldn't normally be associated with spirituality, which is working in the film industry, which is, predominantly ego driven, quite hedonistic, materialistic, competitive, pitched against each other, um, but also hugely community driven, a lot of teamwork and a real bond and connection that you develop with other people from working in those intense environments. But I was acutely aware that I needed to protect my energy in these situations, and that it was very draining on our energy. So in between films, I started to, do some study and training into like energy coaching, and again, deepening my understanding of vibrations and frequency and how to essentially control and manipulate that, which everyone has the capabilities to do. And yeah, that kind of began my sort of energetic pathway.
How old were you when you started to explore that energy work and stuff?
On a kind of action, as opposed to just playing around when I was a kid and
Yeah.
still kind of,
Yeah, when you
waving my wand about.
yeah, when you actively started to be like, right, let's research this.
I think about 22, 23.
Mm.
That's when I started wanting to just, because there was so much out there. You'd go to like a mind, body, spirit exhibition, and you'd be like, which, there's so much, and it was all a bit overwhelming. And I just was like, I need to follow down the bits that really land with me, that feel tangible. And I think I then studied that energy coaching when I was, yeah, about 23 or 24. Then I would go back into film, do a load of films, come out of that, do a bit more of that work, get then obviously discovered Reiki, and was able, that was again a tangible modality of energy healing that felt like I could talk to, my granddad about that without having total crazy wide eyes looking back at
Yeah.
me.
Mm-hmm.
But was still relatively, out there in terms of what they were all up to. And then it wasn't until I became pregnant with my kids and that I found Qigong, because I couldn't do yoga anymore. And as soon as I started doing Qigong, that was really like when I started to tangibly feel myself manipulating my energy. And that was when I was like, okay, this is no longer just something that's in my head. I could feel in 10 minutes the change in my energy. I could feel and sense my energy in my hands, and the ability to change my state of being. And from that, I was like, okay, this will be my life's work. When did did you start doing? You went off and did yoga first, isn't that right?
Yeah, yeah. So I was living in London and I found, I don't know why I wanted to do yoga. I really can't remember the moment, but I was living in Clapham right next to Brixton, and maybe I'd seen or somebody had been to hot yoga, and that just really appealed to me. Not only to do like difficult
Mm.
yoga, but also in a 42-degree room.
Like really
Because I love the
hard.
heat as well. Oh, that was it. Greg and I were going to India, and I
Mm.
thought if I'm going to practice yoga in India, I better prepare to get used to the heat. So I found this yoga studio called Fierce Grace and did my first class. Completely obsessed with it because I came from a dance background. Because I come from a dance background, the moves I actually find not easy, but they come quite naturally to me. So to be able to watch somebody and then do the pose pretty much like how they're doing it, that felt quite easy. But I was coasting through, maybe did about 5 years of that without really getting any of the spiritual benefits because it's not something that I really understood then. And I'm not sure if I really tried, to be honest. I think I went for the physical. I went because it made me feel amazing. I sweated out. I used to do it like 4 or 5 times a week at 6:30 in the morning, and then I'd
Hot
go to
yoga.
work, hot yoga. Yeah, we just feel incredible. But there was zero community.
Mm.
You arrive in silence. It was very serious in that respect. You get to the studio, sort of say hi to the receptionist, nice lady, and then you get changed, you go downstairs. As soon as you enter the room, it's silent. There's a bit of music on, but you're not allowed to talk to anyone.
Is that normal in hot yoga?
Um,
I've never done it. I'm so
no, I mean I've done it
super.
recently, and I'm there chat in a way, like lots of conversations. But it wasn't Bikram, but I had a sense that it had some of the same sort of rules and ideas had led through maybe into that hot yoga space, which actually now when I'm now because I'm a yoga teacher, I wouldn't like it people turning up and me being like, no, you could be quiet
Mhm.
before. But actually, to get yourself into a place where you're about to do some really intense
Mm.
poses, I actually didn't mind it. But it meant that if you're not talking before the yoga, you're certainly not going to talk to people out when you leave. And people just got their shit and left, or they got in the shower and then
So it
left.
was 6:30 in the morning.
It's also 6:30. So by this point, it's 7:30 in the morning.
Mm.
Everyone's been up since 6 or 5:30. So I'm not expecting a huge lot
A
of
lot to say,
conversation. I've got a lot
even
to
from
say.
you.
I know, even from me. But I remember thinking, when I become a yoga teacher, I don't
Gonna
want
rub it
this.
on.
Yeah, I'm gonna just allow it to be a really open space for people to make friends and connections and stuff. Um, and then I went to Greg, my husband, and I went to India, and we went to Rishikesh, which is like a really powerful spiritual place. And we went and stayed up in the mountains in a tent, um, and like looked down at the Ganges, and it was amazing. We swam in the waters as well, and we went to the ashram, the Beatles ashram. And at that point, I was like, okay, I've been doing yoga, but I haven't really been doing yoga. Like from a outsider's perspective, it looks like I've been doing it, but I knew full well that I wasn't doing it. So when I came back, I knew that I wanted to do a yoga teacher training course. So I just kept on telling people that was what I was going to do. And then it wasn't really until I went to India again and did the training course that actually I understood the power of meditation. And I think I actually remember Googling what is spiritual? Like what does it mean to be spiritual? Because I remember thinking, I'm saying it, but I don't know what it is. I never had that feeling.
Mm.
And even now when people say somebody said to me the other day, like, oh, you're really spiritual. I was like, oh no, I don't know if I don't know if I'd describe myself as like really spiritual. I would just say, I know the podcast is called Spiritual Waffle, but I am, yeah, I still don't really know how to describe it. It sometimes makes you feel icky, I suppose, because I think people have negative connotations towards being spiritual. And I know there are some spiritual people out there who like totally take the piss and who should not be allowed to be called spiritual.
Mhm.
And there's people out there who just don't give themselves that label, no, who are incredibly connected to source and spirit and all those kinds of energies. But yeah, when I came back after the yoga teacher training and I had learned pranayama and I had learned not learned how to meditate. I'd learned how to learn how to meditate. I'd learned how to sit and just sit with my emotions. And that was the first proper seed that got planted for me to then go, okay, well, what else? Like what else does it mean to be on a spiritual journey? And who else can I learn from? And I remember loving so much learning again. I hated learning in school. I was so shit at. I honestly, sometimes people come out with this stuff and I'm like, how do you know that? And they say, well, I learnt that in school. I'm like, how? How do you remember? I didn't, I used to cram in the knowledge the day before the test. And then the moment I walked out of that hall, I forgot every single thing that I learned.
Same.
I just I couldn't sit still. I would not take in any
I didn't
information
find it
unless I
interesting.
didn't find it interesting at all. Art was my favorite subject, or
Mm.
dance. Psychology was kind of interesting to me, but I did not do very well because I couldn't remember any of the et als and all of the studies. I just couldn't retain that information. So I didn't enjoy learning until I learned a subject that I enjoyed, yoga.
Mm.
And I remember coming back and being that thirst for knowledge. And then I did I did like an extended meditation course and an extended breathing coach course, and I just wanted to soak up as much as possible. And what I love about being in this field is that you can never, I'm not sure if you could ever really call yourself a teacher, even though I'm pretty sure I just did just say I'm a yoga teacher, but it's more a facilitator, an instructor, not even a guide necessarily, but we're always learning. I really genuinely did think at some point in my life I will have learned everything I need to learn. I think I was in my teens when I thought that, but I was like, when I learn this, that'll be great. I can tick that off the list. The more you learn, the more you realize you absolutely don't know what the hell you're talking about, and all you can do is just continue to look to others as teachers and as guides, and that everybody can teach you something, and whether that's in the spiritual realm or not, it doesn't matter.
Mm.
I feel like I've gone on a fun tangent, but basically, yeah, that India is the answer to that. Is the short answer to that question.
But yeah, no, I think you've touched on a really important point, which is why we even decided to do this podcast. There can be such a negative connotation about the word spiritual that puts it around the man that's on top of the mountain with the top knot and the dreadlocks doing all the meditating under the tree. And that everything else that we're up to isn't spiritual. Whereas I feel like a everything, in my opinion, like my beliefs, my understanding is that we are spiritual beings, be it whether you want to call that source energy, universal life force energy, God, or just a bunch of highly intelligent cells that cannot be destroyed, that can only change form back into their source energy when the body dies. That means that we are innately spiritual with regards to whatever we're doing. If you're stealing a car, it's still a spiritual experience because you're
Don't steal a car, by the way.
we don't endorse
No, we've not be
that.
held responsible.
But you can still call it spiritual if you deem, everything, butter in your toast. We're spirits having a human experience. That is, to me, spirituality. I think the fascination with, in inverted commas, spirituality now is actually more of a case of remembering who we actually are rather than a quest for spirituality. We're already spiritual. It's about remembering our power, remembering what we actually fundamentally are, and how some of that has been hidden from us, that innate power. But if we are made up of the same cells that the universe is made up of, that the cosmos, that each other are, then we're made up of God. And God, that God energy, is capable of anything. I think what we're looking for when we talk about spirituality is that link between, that tangible link between feeling and experiencing ourselves as the gods that we all are and that everything is. So I think then our whole point of this podcast is to talk about different modalities of that would be deemed spirituality, from our perspective and from kind of farmer girl and girl from the streets of
Belfast,
Belfast,
yeah.
and how that relates to us and
Mm.
how that we use these modalities to sort of recalibrate, rebalance, remember who we
Yeah,
really are.
and I don't know, but I don't think tribes such as the Yamanama in Brazil, would they class themselves as spiritual, or are they just who they are? And in who they are connected to their ancestors, they're connected to spirit, they're connected to source, they're connected to nature. would they describe themselves as spiritual? Is it because we don't have that anymore? We've been so disconnected, which is why where I see this yearning for ceremony and this yearning for plant medicine and initiations that we no longer have as a community, like it's just been completely forgotten about. Like, is that, yeah, is that what
Mm.
we're missing? And we're just, we're calling it spirituality because it's easy to put it in underneath one big heading. And if you don't like one part of spirituality, or you're scared by it, or you don't understand, or you think it's a load of bollocks, then you can just tie everything else up underneath that heading and just lock yourself off from it completely, which I think is really sad. I've been I feel like been on this sort of journey of exploration in the spiritual realm for a while, well, for sort of 10 years, and I've watched Greg go through it. And P.S. Both of our husbands will be on the podcast at some point, so we can really
Mhm.
grill them. But I've sort of felt a little bit like I've led him through it, or been like, "Ooh, what about this? What about this?" And he has come from a rather not cynical, but just he just questions stuff a lot of the time. He needs a bit more scientific evidence than maybe I would do. I go with a feeling. He leads with his head. I lead with my body. So if I feel like something is true for me in that moment, then that is what I will believe. I don't necessarily need a lot of research. I would like a little bit of science, I suppose, just so I can cognitively understand what it is that's happening. But really, I just feel it. And I've watched Greg sort of move through these different paths and going through breath work and plant medicine and yoga and all these other things. And but I said to him the other day, like, okay, you might not believe in everything. I don't know if everyone believes in everything, but isn't it much more fun being on this side? Like, you can be a skeptical person and you can, oh no, I don't believe that, and that's a load of hooey and that's woo woo. But my personal experience is I am having so much more fun on this side of the fence because I just feel like a massive child. I'm like, well, what if that can happen with breathing, with breath work, and that is potentially a gift that we've been given, that we can go to altered states of consciousness, and we've been given plant medicine, and we know that the ground and the earth feeds us and nourishes us so well, and then we've been given this gift of like mushrooms that send us into this other state. It's meant to open our mind. Like, that ain't an accident. It's just simply not an accident. So when you open, it's about opening your mind, I suppose. The more you open up to it, the more you're like, wow, is there a kid in a candy store?
Mm.
Like, what can I do? It's magic.
Yeah.
It's basically magic. And it's great fun, which is why we're doing the podcast.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that both of us have the husbands, the divine masculine, that are incredibly cynical. And I feel like I'm on a tether, and I'm all up in the clouds and in the skies and get very overexcited, and also just like to get high. And so Dylan's there, kind of reeling in the rope and always playing devil's advocate with, because a bit like you, I'll just feel something and be like, that is 100% true and
Yeah.
right for me.
Mm.
And then Dylan enter him and Mr. Cynicism. And sometimes I think he just likes an argument. He calls it a debate, but I think it's just he wants to argue the other point, even when he actually agrees with my side of it. But that does also help. It also helps me want to gain and gather some of that scientific
And
side of it.
contextualize it. It is
Yeah.
good to be challenged. I know that with Greg and I, and actually speaking to my mum about some things. My mum loves to play devil's advocate, and she's like, okay, well, what about this? It's actually really helpful
Mm.
because I'm able to stand my ground and put to language what I feel so deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I don't know how to answer a question, I'll be like, okay, well, that's something that I need to have a little bit more of a research for and come back.
But yeah, interestingly, like we're lucky that in this day and age, there's a lot of sophisticated technology now around to sort of study and actually back up some of the things that we just feel. But it's not to say our ancestors, nobody had any technology back then.
Google did not exist back then.
No, there was
But
no
they all felt
aura
it.
machines
Yeah.
or cameras, but they just intuitively knew. The plants were talking to them, telling them to, eat me, eat
But like,
me.
look at like Pocahontas, like look at Moana. Okay, I know they're Disney Pixar, but they have come from these like ancient tribes and these ancient people that have all this wisdom. And what you're telling me, that all of these thousands of tribes that used to exist all talked to each other and all have very similar ideas of energy of working with nature, not working with, being with nature. We are part of it. You know, the way they treat animals, spirit, energy, everything gets repeated the world over.
Mm-hmm.
Back when they had no forms of communication, so there has to be something in that. It's not just a coinkydink
Mm-hmm.
that people in Africa have got the same sort of connection to spirit as people in India and the people in Alaska. Like, just no way.
I think that's really important as well. This isn't like, sometimes they talk about like the new age stuff, new age woo woo stuff, but actually, this isn't new
It's old
age.
age.
It's really, really
It's
old,
really old.
really ancient,
Yeah.
ancient ways that we
Like before
are,
books.
trying to reconnect with
Yeah.
because of that wisdom, and even, I mean, we will do a whole podcast on plant medicine, but even if you were to talk about plant medicine with the ancient tribes, and those cultures, you say like, well, how did you even know to first mix a particular vine with another particular vine to make a particular concoction? They will answer very simply by saying the plants told us. They're communicating at a much higher frequency and level than what we're capable of. And I think there's a yearning and a hunger within us to reconnect to that power. And because we know it's possible.
Yeah.
We know it's possible, but we just become disconnected in the West, and we are just trying to retether ourselves to that ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
And so from that, we're going to explore and take a deep dive into the different modalities, some of which we practice and instruct ourselves, some of which we have just tried. And if anyone comes up with any that we haven't, well, bloody hell, we'll give it a go.
And then some that we know absolutely bugger all about. And that's when we get in people that we can have a really good chat about. But yeah,
Who know lots about.
Who know lots about. Yeah, yeah. And we can quiz them and ask all the questions that we've been wanting to ask. So yeah, thank you so much. Hoping that you join us on this Spiritual Waffle podcast journey. And thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, guys. See you next time. Peace out.
Excellent. Snap to finish. Need a wee.
Oh my God, my legs.